going to involve gray line DXing. And I'm reluctant to use the whiteboard that we also use to project the image on. But if you look over here, just a couple preliminary points to start the discussion. And I'll correlate to that map in just a minute. But what we're talking about here is basically taking advantage of what we refer to as the gray line, which refers to the terminator over Earth at any given time that separates basically day and night. So if you look in conjunction with what we're seeing on this map here, which is a gray line map, we're looking at the terminator as it cuts across on this conventional projection, and again defines, in this case, morning and the onset of evening as it travels to the west. So again, hams are going to use the terminology gray line. The official scientific terminology would be to describe it as the terminator.
Terminator?
The terminator. Having nothing to do with the movie. Bands that are typically affected by gray line propagation. Well, interestingly enough, this is subject to debate. I can tell you by personal experience that gray line propagation works on 40 meters. It's been my favorite band to do DX chasing on for a number of years. And the effects are very pronounced there, and they're very predictable, thus the star next to 40. The other two principal bands that are involved, where you can take advantage of gray line DXing strategies, are 80 and 160. Now you'll notice that I've also mentioned 20 in here. The whole theory of gray line DXing is exactly that. It's still a theory. It describes accurately a whole series of propagation phenomenon, but there's still some debate as to just how true the models are for gray lining right now, and also what the bands are. A key consideration about what gray line DXing is all about is the way the D level in the ionosphere works to absorb signals. And basically what some suggest is that absorption ceases to be important at around the 15 megahertz point, which would include then 20 as part of gray line DXing, or a band that can take advantage of it. It's just not as pronounced as it is on 40, 80, or 160. All right, what we're going to do is begin with a little bit of a review. So I don't know whether you remember this, because God help me, I did my propagation part of the exams in the days when they had the advanced ticket. And I remember having to go through and master all this stuff, which drove me crazy at the time. Today, it's incorporated as part of your extra license training. But a lot of people, they sort of memorize it to get through the exam. It never really dawns on them how to apply it. So that's what we're going to try and focus on tonight. The one thing about gray line DXing that's very interesting, though, is a lot of people confuse the whole concept of gray line DXing with two related scenarios: sunrise signal enhancement and sunset signal enhancement. To a lot of people, what that terminology describes is the phenomenon that they think is actually gray line DXing. It really isn't. It's what I would call one-way gray line DXing, for reasons that we'll get into and discuss in just a minute. But doing the analysis for doing gray line all works with that software. So my whole point, just concluding on the overture here, is that the gray line map can be used to pinpoint opportunities for true gray line DXing, as well as taking advantage of sunrise signal enhancement and sunset signal enhancement. So if you take a look at what we've got up on the screen right now, this is the gray line map, and it's working in real time. And so if you take a look at it, you will note that it gives the current time and just indicates that it refreshes at 5-minute intervals. And what it's accurately doing, again, as it follows across North America, is it's basically telling you where the sun is setting. So it looks like right now we're somewhere maybe over Colorado, Nevada, somewhere in that vicinity. The other thing that you have to appreciate, though, is that on the other side of this depiction is what? The arrival of sunrise. So whenever you look at a gray line map, you're always going to see this blocked out area, which Stan just described as the smudge, and the light areas, because they're basically describing where the sunlight is and where darkness is across the planet Earth. Now I want to tell you a little bit of a story. Has the internet and the laptop computer improved things? Yeah, I think so. So we do live in an era where I cannot pick up the phone anymore and dial 411 and get free information pick up a phone number, though I can look it up online. But let me tell you something, what the internet and computers have done for gray line forecasting has made it an awful lot cheaper. Because I was telling Stan this story, and Fred, this is something you can relate to. When I was up at ARRL in Salem, New Hampshire buying my Icon 746, about a year after you bought yours, I am trying it out and I'm in love with the rig. And as I'm sitting there, and that rig I think sold for about $1,500 thereabouts. And it was an awful lot of rig for the money.
Yeah, well, slightly less than that.
But my principal point is this. Over the operating position that I was at, trying out the Icon, was a mechanical gray line map. Anybody ever see one of these things?
Yeah.
Kenwood used to make them.
Yeah.
They're a couple $1,000s.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, you can still buy them.
yeah, no, you wouldn't. You could, but you wouldn't. But you're right. 2000 when they first came out, 1200 a couple of years later. I was telling Stan by the time I got there, the guy was trying to give me a bargain at it for $400 in conjunction with taking away the Icon. But the point is, this is freeware, and you're not buying anything. And you're getting basically the same information that you would if you bought that old-fashioned piece of hardware. So what we're going to do to set this in motion is we're going to start off with a little bit of a review. And this is propagation, but we're going to try and keep it directly focused on what we need to understand for what we're discussing here. So let me just break this up. Now, I didn't have time to put together an individual presentation, so this is sort of a assortment of things gathered from 3 different presentations. And just acknowledge the role of Mr. Tarpley from the ARRL South Carolina section. This is a presentation that he did at one of the Hamfests. Okay, so just a couple things. Right now, the focus for gray line DXing is going to be with respect to the high HF bands. So, you know, the classic ones, 80 up to and including 10 meters. And in the process, what we're going to do is just talk a little bit about ionospheric layers, and also talk specifically about the D layer and its absorptive role and how that affects gray line DXing strategies. But what it brings out here, and this is straight out of Propagation 101, is that when we think in terms of propagation, we have ground wave propagation. Think your AM broadcast band, right? Also, how many people grew up with that old Philco AM radio receiver that your parents might have brought from their parents' house when they first got married? What did you notice was right above the broadcast band in the old days? The primitive police band. 1600, 1800 kcs in those days. Why? Good demonstrated ground wave capability to communicate across a large municipality. All right, not particularly relevant though once you get really past 80 meters. Next in line, direct wave line of sight. Ordinarily, when we're thinking of that, we're thinking of VHF style operation, right? And then skywave, which is what we're going to be focusing on here. Okay, so ground waves, again, we've pretty much disposed of it as much as we need to. It's going to be affected by noise levels. You know, in the AM broadcast band, 100, 200 mile range, although if you get a clear carrier station, it's amazing that you can still hear them from across the country. But when you apply this to the ham bands, once you get up to around 80 meters, you're talking about ground wave limitations of probably 50 miles or so. So not a real big factor in long distance communication. Again, direct waves, we are normally thinking in terms of line of sight, propagation, so typical of the VHF bands, but also starts to come into play in conjunction with, say, 20 meters on up. But what we really want to focus on is skywave propagation. Okay, so here we're talking about the notion of ionospheric reflection of our radio signal. And pretty much, if you are willing to work across all bands and constantly monitor them, you will usually have some skywave capability on some bands somewhere, pretty much 24 hours a day. But now let's get into the ionosphere and talk a little bit about the layers that are involved. And just note that it's going to be your skywave that's going to be handling almost everything that we do at the lower and very low frequency levels, as well as just HF and medium frequency levels as well, and to a certain extent, VHF. The example in VHF being that on 6 meters, for instance, you can occasionally get sporadic E-style propagation. But now we get to the regions, and this is key for when we're talking about gray line DXing. So, 4 of them principally. The first one, though, is not our friend, and that's the D layer. So it just tells you that typically we're seeing the D layer up at about 38 to 55 miles above Earth, followed by the E layer, which is up there at around 62 to 75 miles. And as we talk about these first 2 layers, here's what's important to know. The D layer is not capable of reflecting HF signals. What the DF layer is capable of doing is getting in the way and absorbing signal strength. Because in effect, the D level absorption decreases signal strength as it arrives at your intended destination. So the first ionosphere level that gets involved with skywave reflection would be the E layer. And again, the classic example of E layer propagation would be some of the limited propagation that you would see on bands like 160 or 80 meters during the course of a day when you're talking 150 to 200 miles away. But also sporadic E-ionization that you tend to see in the summer period around the equinox in conjunction with 6 meters and 10 meters. So for the true HFers among us, the 2 levels that we're concerned with are the F1 layer, and we're going to see there's a little bit of a variance in terms of how high up it is, depending upon whether it's winter or summer, and also the F2 layer, because they're the ones that are principally responsible for reflecting signals when we're working with the skywave. And it just tells you the density of ionization is greatest in the F layers, therefore their ability to reflect signals back to Earth, and the least in the D layer. The D layer hardly reflects anything at all, it just absorbs signal strength. Okay. The other thing it talks about is the disposition of the layers and what happens to them as you go through the daily solar cycle. So it just tells you that the D layer and the E layer disappear very quickly after sunset. And this is a factor in gray line propagation. But it says the F1 and the F2 layers do not disappear, but merge into a single F layer up at about 150 to 250 miles. And what it basically tells you is, because recombination of your basic electrons that are part of the ionosphere is a slow process, the F layer is typically ionized and capable of reflecting signals until dawn. The point is, the D layer basically gets in the way of your signal strength and absorbs signals, wanes near the end of the day, and disappears in conjunction with sunset. And that's what makes gray line DXing possible. D layer, again, 38 to 55 miles up. It starts being created at sunrise, and sunrise is another key period for gray line DXing strategies, and largely disappears immediately after sunset. It's not our friend. As it says, it plays only a negative role. It doesn't do any reflection of signals. All it does is absorb signals. And as a result, signals that pass through the D layer, both going up and returning to Earth, are losing some of their signal strength based on the fact that they do have to pass through the D layer. So, only plays a negative role in HF communications. Now, part of the presentation here gets largely theoretical, but again, the whole notion here is that because it has relatively low-level electron density, it's not capable of reflecting RF signals back to Earth. And it's there largely in an absorptive capacity. Now, all we really want to focus on here is, here's the equation for D-layer absorption. Fred, you may be able to comprehend this.
I'm trying to memorize it.
Right? But what's the summary at the bottom that's important? It says, absorption is inversely proportional to the square of the frequency, so D-layer absorption is unimportant above 10 meters. So what does this tell us? D-layer absorption is going to play a major role with 40, 80, and 160. And those are the bands they identified up on the whiteboard initially. The stance being made by this guy, who's not really trying to address gray line DXing though, is such that D-layer absorption is insignificant above 10 megahertz. Opinions differ. And the other study that you'll see me quote from later just tells you, no, there's evidence of significant absorption all the way up to 15 megahertz thus the inclusion by some of 20 meters as being amenable to a gray line DXing strategy. Okay, so the E layer is created at sunrise. It reaches its maximum density around noon and drops in density by about 90% shortly after sunset. It can return lower HF frequencies to the Earth, resulting in daytime short skip on the lower HF bands. Again, we're talking 160 and 80 for very limited duration in terms of miles. Can be an important factor in terms of medium frequency or 160 propagation during darkness. But again, when we're thinking of the layers that we're going to work with mostly for ground wave return to Earth, it's going to be the F1 and the F2 layers. Again, examples of E layer, sporadic E that you see happening in conjunction with the equinoxes on 10 meters and 6 meters is a result of reflection from the E layer, and usually the distance traveled is going to max out at around 1,250 miles. But now we get into the key for propagation, and that's the F layer. Tends to vary in terms of altitude, and this is just based on the fact that there's more sun in the northern hemisphere or in the hemisphere of choice during the summer season than there is during the winter season. So it extends the F1 layer from about 125 to 150 miles in the winter and about 160 to 180 miles in the summer. Again, thicker because there's greater ionization due to more solar presence. And the F2 layer is up above that, just a little bit higher. And these are the babies that we use for long-haul communications. What it does indicate, though, is that since you will get F-layer ionization throughout the hours of darkness, that's the only layer that will do that, it carries almost all the nighttime communications that you guys are going to get involved with internationally when you're DXing. All right. Summary on the F layer then. By the last 2 points, the F layer strongly bends radio waves into the HF region, and the layer does not significantly absorb RF passing through it. It reflects it, it doesn't attenuate it. That's the way I would describe it. All right. From here, it just goes into a little bit of discussion about daily propagation effects. And what I want to do is just make a couple more points, and then we will shift back to a more specific gray line oriented part of the presentation. So it says the D layer acts as a selective absorber and definitely attenuates frequencies below 5 megahertz and still, by the judgment of most, below 10 megahertz. Short skip propagation is possible via the E or F layers on frequencies from 5 to 10 megahertz when the local time at the ionospheric refraction point is approximately noon. But the F2 layer, if sufficiently ionized, can support international or intercontinental communications above 10 megahertz, basically 24 hours a day and through the night. And here, again, we're talking in the frequency range of about 3 to 15 megahertz via the F layer. Daily band selection. I mean, most of us know this through common habit. You want to work anywhere during the day for getting out and working DX, 20, 15, 10, plus the WARC bands. Nighttime, though, 160, 80, 40, 30, and 20 for DX. And, you know, what you're always battling on both 160 and 80 are high noise levels. All right. So basically, what do we want to bring out of this presentation? Because largely I'm done reviewing this and just refreshing everything we've forgotten from our extra or our advanced exam. The F1 layers are your friends. They do no harm. They're the ones that enable DX. The D layer does nothing for you but get in the way. What's the secret to gray line DXing? To identify when the D layer ionization has decreased significantly, either in your locale where you're located, or in the locale of the stations that you're trying to work. Okay, but for just a second, let's go back and pull up that map. All right. So, gray line DXing. Now, I kind of know my U.S. geography. It looks like at this stage of the game, yeah, well, we're updating every 5 minutes, right? And this is just following the sun's path across the Earth. So it looks like we're in Nevada and California right now. Okay? Looks like at the same time, sunset or sunrise is coming to the Indian subcontinent. I'm inland in California or I'm in Reno, Nevada. I right now, as a result of gray line strategy, have an optimal opportunity to work the Indian subcontinent, which, by the way, I don't know how many of you have been successful in working India. Show of hands, Indian contacts. I've got one in my entire hand career. One. Very difficult, and it's not that they lack hands, but look where they are in terms of proximity to North America. So, if you are taking advantage of sunlight from the transmitter location that's associated with oncoming dusk, and sunlight in your intended target destination, where you're coming to the onset of sunup, you have the opportunity to work where the F layers are still present and are being ionized, because the sun is still shining on them. They're so far above the Earth's surface. Let me give you an example. Has anyone ever looked at the International Space Station at night and seen it? So what do you notice? It's up there like a beacon. You'd swear to God that it was a moving blimp or a light ship, right?
Yeah.
But what are you seeing? Are you seeing lights? No, you're seeing the reflection of the sun off the body of the satellite. And I would apply that analogy to the F layer. The F layer continues to get reinforced by the sun, but the D layer disappears, right? It disappears at sunset in Nevada, and it hasn't yet built up in India, because the D layer starts to build at sunup. That's what our previous PDF told us, and continues to build from there. Ernest.
How wide would the contact be on either side of the gray line? In other words,
That's a good question. We're maybe talking about 100 miles, but I've never really seen that quantified, to be honest with you. But Ernest's question is, he's looking at what I'm going to call the terminator, and that's what this line really represents. If this was truly a refined map, though, what it might say is gray line and show you a shaded area adjacent to the terminator. Because in effect, the gray line is just, in this case, to the left of the terminator line, and in this case, to the right of the terminator line. Yeah, John?
This brings up a very interesting point.
Yeah.
We're fixed in our location,
Right.
and but as the year progresses, the width of that black area changes.
I've got,
So that says every day you should be able at sunrise and sunset.
good point. Does
to
everybody
make a
appreciate?
really interesting.
Yeah. Does everybody appreciate what Dr. John is saying? Based on seasonal conditions, the appearance of that gray line and where it travels is going to vary. And I've got another PowerPoint that will talk about that in a couple of frames. Yeah, Andy.
So, if I'm understanding correctly, it seems that the D layer is gone under the shadow
Right.
entirely.
Mhm.
F layer is present.
Right.
So really anything under the shadow should be reachable, mutually reachable.
Yeah.
So really it's the edges that are defining the maximum distance that you can expect.
Yeah. In a way, you could look at it like that.
Okay.
But do me a favor, let me just get back to a couple of phenomenon that, to me, I might nickname one-way gray lining, if I was caught with my terminology, but which the two authors that I was reviewing today described as the sunrise signal enhancement and sunset signal enhancement scenarios. Because they're more relevant to sort of the mixed scenario that you were just describing a minute ago, where you were talking about me maybe being out in Nevada or California, being able to talk to people in the dark areas. And why is that? Because my signal, as it goes up to get the F layer, is not being absorbed by the D layer. I'm getting that advantage on one side of the transaction. I'm not getting it on the reciprocating part of the QSO, though. In other words, this fellow who's trying to talk to me here, that's in the dark area, is not going to get quite the same results that I'm going to get. Again, optimal two-way is from somebody in California to this side of the line to someone on the subcontinent to the right-hand side of the line. Well, do me a favor, let me embellish it to just include the other 2 points, and then you can just take it from there. So when someone starts describing the related phenomenon that most people, by the way, assume is gray line, And when they think of gray line, that's what they're thinking. Sunrise signal enhancement, which optimizes signals from the west. Sunset signal enhancement, which optimizes signals from the east. Let me give you a couple examples. God help me, I was just recently in the CQ DX sideband competition last weekend. This is what you'll notice, and this is an example of